From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A massacre in Moscow suggests that Islamic State may be making a comeback, perhaps from a sanctuary in Afghanistan. Plus, the Biden administration raises the pressure on Israel, not Hamas, in its last bastion in the city of Rafah. But Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel is going in anyway. The growing world disorder is our subject today in Potomac Watch. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the WSJ Opinion pages, here with my esteemed colleagues, Bill McGurn and Kim Strassel. Welcome. The massacre at the concert venue on the outskirts of Moscow on Friday evening, 137 killed so far, dozens wounded, many seriously. The killers fired away at the concert goers for a long time, set fire to the building, and then escaped in a car, if you can believe it. Terrible lapse of Russian security, which now says it has found at least 4 of the killers who've confessed under interrogation, including what appears to be torture, if you believe the release of the photos from the Russian security services. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin suggests that maybe Ukraine was responsible because the attackers were found heading toward Ukraine. Others in his government are blaming the U.S., but Ukraine denies it. And the U.S. says its information is that it was Islamic State, or ISIS as it's known, especially ISIS Khorasan, or the Afghan branch of ISIS that has prospered in that country since President Biden's willy-nilly withdrawal in 2021. The U.S. says it warned Russia before the attack that one was possible, but before the attack, Putin had publicly dismissed that as American attempts to stir trouble. Bill, what do you make of Putin's claims and the evidence you see so far?
Well, we've been here before, right? The evidence so far is, I think, pretty overwhelming that it was ISIS-K that committed this. They took credit for it. The U.S. warned them about it. I don't think there's any evidence to support Putin's claim that it was Ukraine. That's a useful thing for him politically to help him double down on Ukraine. You know, he has a history of doing that with the Chechens and so forth, using war to strengthen his grip on power. So I don't think we can trust anything they say. It's amazing to me when you look at what they were able to accomplish. I think it was 4 men.
Right.
They were shooting for about an hour, roughly an hour in Moscow. And they got away by car. Can you imagine going into New York, into Manhattan? First of all, the traffic would kill you. But,
well, for that matter, Bill, let's say a suburb of Washington. I mean,
right.
Escaping by car into the Maryland woods? I don't think
on
so.
66? No.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it reminds us how vulnerable we are, because I think ISIS has planned further attacks on Europe and so forth. And it's reconstituting itself, maybe not the same as it was before, and muddying all the waters. It's a real threat. And I don't know that we're going to respond strongly enough.
The U.S., Kim, says that it warned Putin under its policy, which they call a duty to warn other governments when the U.S. has intelligence that there might be an attack. It did the same thing before the ISIS attack on Iran, which took place in early January, which killed 84 people in Iran. Iran apparently didn't take that seriously enough either. Russia clearly didn't take this seriously. And I think this attempt to blame Ukraine and this attempt to blame the United States helps deflect from the fact that this was a real dereliction of Russian security.
Yeah, I think it serves a couple of purposes on Putin's point. As you know, we did warn, and quite specifically, the U.S. Embassy, in fact, publicly on March 7th, warned American citizens to avoid concert venues, which would suggest that America had some pretty specific intelligence. It says that it warned again about a week later. Interestingly, at the time, Russia called those warnings provocative and suggested they were intended to intimidate and destabilize the Russian society. So who knows how much attention they were paying. But regardless of the warnings that were ignored, I think, as you say, this deflects a certain degree to an abysmal failure. I mean, remember, this is a security state, Russia, and yet it turns out that when you really need the security, they're nowhere to be found. But the other thing is, by intimating that this has something to do with Ukraine, and Putin has been kind of cagey about this. He came out and gave an address. He didn't directly blame Ukraine. Instead, he suggested they were assisting in the getaway of these ISIS characters, which makes no sense whatsoever. Ukraine has strongly disavowed this.
Well, that suggests that they knew about it.
Yes, exactly. So he's playing games. But look, I think it's really important. Russia has done this. Putin has done this many times before. Back in 1999, there was a series of apartment bombings. People now, in retrospect, think that they were false flag operations, inside jobs staged by Putin and his allies, but they blamed it on the Chechens. He used it to launch the Second Chechen War, elevate himself to power. And he has a history of doing this when his control looks threatened in the country. He uses moments like this. I'm not suggesting this ISIS attack wasn't real, but he uses these moments to shore up support for himself as a strong man, the strong leader of Russia. I think it's not surprising that even as these threats have come through, they issued yet more orders to conscript new series of Russians to go and fight in the Ukrainian war. The intimation this was Ukraine is going to be used to try to rally support for a war that has now dragged into its third year. This is Putin up and down.
All right. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk more about the Moscow massacre and its implications, particularly the rise of ISIS, when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. And let's listen to Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, talking Sunday about the implications from the Moscow massacre of the return of Islamic State.
This is the unfortunate echo of President Biden's chaotic and disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's the same group that killed 13 Americans. Just a few days ago at the Armed Services Committee, I asked our commanding general in the Middle East about ISIS's capacity to project attacks from Afghanistan. He said that in as little as 6 months, and it turned out to be closer to 6 days, that ISIS from Afghanistan, with little or no warning, could attack Western interests across Asia and Europe. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. It's deeply regrettable that innocent civilians, women and children were killed in Moscow, but the next attacks could be against an American embassy in Asia or in Europe, or against, say, students traveling to Europe on a school trip for spring break. Again, this is a very dangerous echo of President Biden's failed withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Bill, this is, I think, an extremely important point that Cotton makes, and politically resonant as well. Just as a factual matter, we had feared that after the withdrawal from Afghanistan of the U.S., meaning we no longer have any listening posts there, we no longer have any ability to attack a terror base if it develops, we feared that there would be a new sanctuary potentially for ISIS and al-Qaeda. The Taliban now that rule Afghanistan are competing with ISIS. They don't like each other. On the other hand, it doesn't appear the Taliban has the wherewithal or maybe even the desire to take on ISIS in Afghanistan, much as it didn't back in the 1990s when al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was using it as a sanctuary. And the real risk there is that if you have a sanctuary like this, ISIS can use it as a base to plan future attacks. And we know, okay, we've got the Iran attack in January. We've now got this Moscow attack. France says it has foiled an attack this year. And France is now on the highest terror alert it has as the Summer Olympics approach in Paris. And then you add that to the testimony that Cotton cites. We're back at a pretty dangerous place here.
Yeah, Paul, you may have worried about becoming a sanctuary again, and Senator Cotton did in the Journal editorial page, but that was certainly not what Joe Biden was worried about, or at least what he told us. What was the phrase? Over-the-horizon capability?
Yep.
We're going to prevent it from becoming sanctuary. We could fly over and do things. It proved to be false. You have to be there. You know, when I was in the Bush White House, one of the rationales for being in Afghanistan is just keep them busy in their hiding out in their tunnels there and so forth, so they don't come over here. Bush constantly said, fight them over there so they don't come here. Now we're going to see them spread out. We don't know where they are. And again, what worries me about Moscow is that it's pretty low-level technology. Even in a security state like Russia, as Kim points out, there are soft targets, very soft targets, and it's not hard for guys with guns to mow down a lot of people. And we're kidding ourselves if we think they haven't figured that out. I think it's a challenge. Look, it certainly is bad news for Vladimir Putin, who is supposed to protect the Russian people. His whole argument is he's a strong man. He's going to keep them safe, defeat foreign threats. It's bad for Joe Biden because it's a consequence of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think it's slightly a challenge to Donald Trump, reminding him that it's important to have our soldiers in different parts of the world that are dangerous, because threats can really fester and manifest themselves later in attacks if we don't. It's a lot less costly to have troops in these sensitive parts of the world than to try to play catch up after an attack.
So the question becomes 7 months to go or so before the presidential election, long time to go, Kim. It looks to me as if there's a vulnerability here politically, potentially, for the president. I mean, Bill's point is very well taken about Donald Trump and troops on the ground. And I think that, Trump wanting to pull out our forces from Syria and Iraq, small troop deployments, intelligence listening posts really would be a mistake. And Trump has wanted those out. So that would be a mistake because they give us valuable intel about ISIS and Iran and other things. But Biden is responsible for having withdrawn from Afghanistan. And if Afghanistan is found to be where plots against Americans are planned and ultimately executed, I think this is very dangerous territory for the president.
Yes, because you're looking at two sides of a coin. When you withdraw, you lose that listening capability, but you also, on the other hand, create a vacuum, a place where they can fill back in again. The Taliban is proving incapable of stopping ISIS-K in that country. But we have a risk in other places. You just mentioned Syria and Iraq. Only recently, the Wall Street Journal had a story about a recent security sweep at a refugee camp in northern Syria that holds about 44,000 people. They found dozens of ISIS militants in there. There are some 9,000 ISIS fighters that are currently in detention centers in Syria. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the Kurdish-led force that joined with the U.S. to defeat ISIS and is still supported by the U.S., it is struggling to contain and maintain operations against ISIS and stop them from filling up Syria as well, too. So if we pull support from there, you're potentially helping to create another haven. Similarly, situation in Iraq. And the president clearly bears responsibility here. There is a direct line, as Cotton said, between our evacuation and leaving of Afghanistan and what is now going on. And I only hope this does become a point of real divide and debate in the presidential election, because we are looking at a global disorder at the moment in many different regions of the world. And now added to that, in addition to the Ukrainian war and everything going on with Israel, we have the rise of Islamic State again, and it ought to be front and center, this question to the candidates, who's going to be more aggressive at stopping that?